In a small farmhouse at the edge of a forgotten town where the war had left more ghosts than people, a man named Samuel Reed sat in total darkness, not because night had fallen, but because the world had simply ceased to exist for him 3 years ago when a German shell exploded 20 feet from his trench, and the last thing his eyes ever saw was white light so bright it burned everything away, leaving only black, endless black. And now Samuel sat in his kitchen listening to the sounds of a life he could no longer see, the tick of the clock he couldn't read, the rustle of curtains moved by wind he couldn't watch, the clatter of a cup he'd just knocked over because depth and distance were concepts that required eyes to understand. And he was about to give up, about to accept that a blind man couldn't live alone on a farm, couldn't take care of himself, couldn't do anything except wait in darkness until someone decided he'd be better off in a home for broken soldiers, where other blind men sat in rows waiting to die. But then he heard it, a sound from the barn that changed everything. His horse, a mare named Clementine, who had somehow survived the war alongside him, who had carried him through mud and fire and death, who was now the only living thing that remembered him as something other than the blind man. And Samuel made a decision that everyone would call crazy, but that would define the rest of his life. He was going to teach his horse to be his eyes. Stay with us, because this story will break your heart and rebuild it and make you question everything you thought you knew about purpose, love, and what happens when the only reason you existed disappears. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Samuel Reed had gone to war in 1916 as a farrier, a man who shot horses for the cavalry, and he'd taken Clementine with him, a young chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face and eyes so intelligent they seemed almost human. And together, they'd survived 4 years of hell that turned boys into ghosts and horses into machines. 4 years of Samuel shoeing hundreds of cavalry horses while shells exploded overhead and gas rolled through trenches like fog made of death. 4 years of Clementine standing perfectly still during bombardments while other horses panicked and broke their legs thrashing against their stalls. 4 years of a bond forming between man and animal that went beyond training or necessity into something deeper, something that felt like family. When the shell exploded in 1918, Samuel was standing in an open field shoeing an officer's horse, and Clementine was tied to a post 20 yards away, and the blast threw Samuel 15 feet through the air. And when he woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, the first thing the doctor told him was that he'd never see again. The optic nerves were destroyed. Nothing could be done. He was 24 years old and blind for life. And the second thing the doctor told him was that his horse had somehow survived the same blast without a scratch and was waiting for him outside, refusing to let anyone else handle her, biting orderlies who tried to lead her away. And Samuel, lying in that hospital bed, unable to see anything, unable to imagine a future, felt something crack inside him that wasn't quite breaking, but wasn't quite healing either. They sent him home 6 months later with a small pension, a white cane he didn't know how to use, and Clementine, who walked beside his wheelchair onto the ship and stood in the cargo hold for 2 weeks without complaint. And when they arrived back in England, when Samuel's sister picked him up and took him back to the family farm that felt like a museum of a life he could no longer live, Clementine was the only familiar thing, the only constant, the only creature that didn't treat him like he was made of glass or pity. The first year was hell. Samuel burned himself on the stove he couldn't see, fell down stairs he forgot were there, knocked over furniture he didn't remember moving, and his sister, God bless her, tried to help, but she had her own family, her own problems. And eventually, she had to have the conversation Samuel knew was coming. Samuel, you can't live alone. You can't take care of yourself. There's a home for veterans in London. They have staff, they have nurses. You'd be safe. And Samuel knew she was right, knew he was a burden, knew he was slowly destroying himself, trying to maintain independence he didn't actually have. But the thought of leaving the farm, leaving Clementine, leaving the only space where he could still feel like himself, was unbearable. That night, Samuel sat in the barn with Clementine, his hands running over her face, her neck, her strong shoulders, and he said out loud what he'd been thinking for months. What if you could be my eyes? What if I taught you to guide me? Dogs do it. Why not you? And Clementine, who couldn't understand words but understood tone, nuzzled his hand, and Samuel laughed for the first time since losing his sight. Because it was crazy, completely crazy. Horses weren't guide animals. Horses were too big, too skittish, too unpredictable. But Samuel was a farrier. He'd spent his whole life understanding horses, reading their moods, communicating through touch and sound. And Clementine wasn't just any horse, she was his horse. She'd walked through war zones without bolting. She'd stood still during artillery strikes. She had the temperament of a saint and the loyalty of a dog, so why not try? The training took 2 years. 2 years of Samuel stumbling through fields while Clementine learned to walk at exactly his pace. 2 years of teaching her to stop at obstacles, to navigate around holes, to pause at stairs. 2 years of developing a communication system based on reins and voice commands and trust. So much trust, because Samuel was literally putting his life in her hooves every time he stepped outside. And Clementine learned it all. Learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Learned to guide him through doorways and around furniture and down paths. Learned that her job wasn't to go where she wanted, but to take Samuel where he needed to be, safely and slowly. Impossibly, it worked. By 1922, Samuel and Clementine had become a team that shocked everyone who saw them. Samuel could walk through town with his hand on Clementine's harness, and she would guide him past carts and people and dogs, would stop at curbs, would find the door to the post office or the general store or the pub, and people who had known Samuel before the war would stop and stare because this was something they'd never seen. A blind man navigating the world, not with a cane or another person, but with a horse, a beautiful chestnut mare who moved with such care, such precision, such obvious love for the man who depended on her. And Samuel, who had spent 2 years in darkness feeling useless and broken, finally felt like himself again. Finally felt like he had purpose. Finally felt like the war hadn't taken everything. They developed routines that became rituals. Every morning at 6, Samuel would wake up and Clementine would already be at the fence waiting. She knew the schedule better than he did, and Samuel would walk out, hand finding her neck without hesitation, and they'd do their morning route, down the lane to the main road, left to the village, stop at the baker for bread, right to the post office for mail, back home by 8. And Clementine never varied, never got distracted, never forgot that her job was to be Samuel's eyes. And Samuel loved her for it, loved her more than he'd ever loved anything, because she'd given him back his life, his independence, his dignity. The villagers grew accustomed to seeing them, the blind veteran and his guide horse, and children would ask their parents why the man had a horse instead of a dog. And parents would explain that Samuel and Clementine had been in the war together, had survived together, had bonded in a way that transcended normal human-animal relationships. And the children would watch in awe as Clementine guided Samuel across busy streets with the precision of a surgeon and the gentleness of a mother. Samuel's sister stopped suggesting the veteran's home, stopped worrying quite so much, because Samuel was thriving. He'd learned to cook using touch and memory. He'd learned to maintain the farm with Clementine's help. She'd pull the plow while Samuel held the handles. She'd help him find tools he dropped. She'd alert him to visitors by changing her pace. And slowly Samuel built a life that looked nothing like the one he'd lost, but was beautiful in its own way. A life built on trust and routine and the unconditional love of an animal who had chosen to be his eyes. 15 years passed. 15 years of Samuel and Clementine moving through the world as one unit. 15 years of people saying they'd never seen anything like it. 15 years of Samuel waking up, grateful that he hadn't given up that night in the barn, hadn't accepted defeat, hadn't let blindness make him invisible. And it was all because of Clementine, because she'd been willing to learn a job that no horse should have to learn, because she'd been patient when he made mistakes, because she'd never once failed him, never once led him astray, never once forgotten that he was depending on her completely. But time is cruel to everyone. And by 1937, Samuel was 53 years old, his body worn down by war injuries and a lifetime of physical labor. And one cold January morning, he woke up feeling wrong, feeling heavy, feeling like his chest was being crushed, and he called for his sister, but the words came out slurred and weak, and he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, and he fell, hitting the floor hard, and the last thing he heard before consciousness faded was Clementine in the barn, whinnying, somehow knowing something was wrong despite being 50 yards away. And then darkness, deeper than blindness, absolute. Samuel Reed died in the hospital 3 days later. Stroke complications, the doctor said. He'd been lucky to survive as long as he had given his war injuries. He'd lived a good life considering, and Samuel's sister made the arrangements, planned the funeral, cleaned out the farmhouse, and tried to figure out what to do with Clementine, who at 17 years old was too old to sell, too specialized to place, and Samuel's sister didn't have space for a horse, didn't have the knowledge to care for one, so she made the difficult decision to send Clementine to a horse sanctuary outside town, a place where old horses could live out their days in peace. The day they came to take Clementine, she didn't want to go. She stood at the fence staring at the farmhouse door, waiting for Samuel to come out, waiting for their morning routine to start, and when the handlers tried to lead her to the trailer, she pulled back, confused, agitated, and they had to use 2 men and a lead rope to finally get her loaded. And as the trailer pulled away, Clementine's eyes were fixed on that door, still waiting, still believing Samuel would appear. The sanctuary was nice enough, rolling green fields, a clean barn, other horses for company, but Clementine didn't integrate, didn't socialize, didn't graze with the others. She stood at the fence closest to the road, staring toward town, toward the farm, toward Samuel, and the sanctuary workers tried everything. Better food, different pastures, companion animals, but nothing worked. Clementine was waiting for Samuel, waiting for her job to start, waiting for purpose. After 2 weeks, Clementine did something that broke every worker's heart. She started walking the fence line in a specific pattern, the exact same route she used to walk with Samuel, from the gate to the oak tree to the water trough and back. The same route every day, same time, same pace. And the workers realized she was walking their old morning route. She was trying to do her job, even though Samuel wasn't there, trying to maintain the routine that had defined her life for 15 years. And when they tried to interrupt the pattern, tried to lead her away, she would panic, would fight back to the fence, back to the root, because the root was all she had left of Samuel. The root was her purpose, and without it, what was she? The sanctuary owner called Samuel's sister and explained the situation. Your brother's horse is grieving. She won't eat properly, won't rest. She just walks the same pattern over and over. I've never seen anything like it. She's looking for him, and I don't know how to make her understand he's not coming back. And Samuel's sister came to visit, stood at the fence watching Clementine walk her invisible route, and cried because this horse had loved her brother in a way that was almost human, had given him 15 years of service and companionship and purpose, and now she was lost, literally lost, walking a route to nowhere, looking for a man who would never call her name again. Months passed. Clementine grew thinner, her coat lost its shine, her eyes lost their intelligence and became distant, hollow, and the sanctuary workers tried everything, but she was dying of heartbreak, dying of purposelessness, dying because the job that had defined her existence no longer existed, and she couldn't understand why, couldn't understand where Samuel had gone, couldn't understand why he'd abandoned the routine. And every morning at 6, she'd start her route, walking the fence line with the same careful precision she'd used to guide Samuel through town, stopping at imaginary curbs, pausing at invisible doorways, her body going through motions her mind couldn't let go of, because this was who she was. This was what she did. She was Samuel's eyes. And without Samuel, what was the point of seeing? The sanctuary owner made the call that everyone knew was coming. She's suffering. She's not responding to treatment. She's given up. I think it's time to consider euthanasia. It's the kindest thing. And Samuel's sister agreed, because watching Clementine waste away was unbearable, was cruel, and they scheduled it for the following week. And the sanctuary workers said their goodbyes to a horse who had served a purpose so completely that losing that purpose had destroyed her. But 3 days before the scheduled date, something happened that no one expected. A young boy from the village, maybe 8 years old, whose grandfather had known Samuel, came to the sanctuary with his mother and asked if they could visit Clementine. My granddad told me about the blind soldier and his guide horse. He said they were heroes. I wanted to see her. And the sanctuary owner hesitated but agreed, led them to Clementine's pasture, and the boy approached the fence and said, clear and confident, "Good morning, Clementine," the exact words Samuel used to say every morning at 6, and Clementine's head snapped up, ears forward, and she walked over to the fence, pressed her nose against the boy's hand, and for the first time in months, her eyes looked alive, looked focused, because someone had spoken to her the way Samuel used to speak to her. Someone had acknowledged her not as a broken horse, but as Clementine, guide horse, Samuel's eyes. And for just a moment, she had purpose again. The sanctuary owner watched this and had an idea, called Samuel's sister, called the local veterans group, called everyone he could think of, and proposed something radical. What if we don't put her down? What if instead we let people visit her? War veterans who remember Samuel, children who want to learn about service animals, anyone who wants to meet the famous guide horse. We could set up visiting hours, let people come and talk to her, acknowledge her service, give her purpose again. Not the same purpose, but something. And Samuel's sister, desperate for any alternative to euthanasia, agreed. They started small, a few veterans who remembered Samuel, who came and stood by Clementine's fence and told her she was a good horse, that she'd served well, that Samuel would be proud, and Clementine would stand very still, ears forward, listening, and something in her changed, not healing exactly, but not dying either, like she was holding on. The local newspaper heard about it and ran a story, the guide horse who lost her purpose. And suddenly people from all over the county were coming to visit. Some brought carrots, some brought stories about their own service animals. Some just came to stand quietly with a horse who represented something bigger than herself, loyalty and service, and the tragedy of loving something so completely that losing it breaks you. And Clementine tolerated it all, stood at the fence, accepted the attention, but every morning at 6, she still walked her route, still paused at invisible obstacles, still did the job, even though the job no longer existed, because that's what Samuel had taught her. That's who she was. A year passed. Clementine was 18 now, old for a horse, but she'd stopped declining, had stabilized at a new normal. She wasn't thriving, but she was surviving, and the visitors kept coming. School groups learning about service animals, veterans dealing with their own losses, people who just needed to be near something that understood grief. And Clementine became something unexpected, not a guide horse anymore, but a therapy horse, giving comfort simply by existing, by representing unshakable loyalty, by showing that purpose can change but doesn't have to disappear. Samuel's sister came to visit on what would have been Samuel's 55th birthday, stood at the fence and said, "I'm sorry I sent you away. I didn't understand that the farm wasn't just where you lived, it was where you worked, it was your purpose, and I took that from you. But look at you now. You found a new purpose, helping people understand what love and service look like. Samuel would be so proud, and Clementine, who couldn't understand the words but understood the tone, nuzzled her hand, and Samuel's sister cried because this horse had loved her brother with a purity that humans rarely achieve, had given him 15 years of freedom and dignity, and even in her grief, even in her loss, she was still serving, still helping, still being more than anyone expected a horse to be. Clementine lived 3 more years. 3 years of visitors and quiet days, and that morning route she never stopped walking, and when she finally died at 21, peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer night, the sanctuary buried her on the property under a tree, and they put a stone that read, Clementine, 1915 to 1938, guide horse and friend to Samuel Reed. She never forgot her purpose. And hundreds of people came to the memorial service because Clementine had become more than just a horse. She'd become a symbol of what it means to love something so completely that losing it changes you forever, to have a purpose so deep that it becomes your identity, and to face the loss of that purpose with dignity and grace even when it destroys you. Samuel's sister donated his war medals to the sanctuary to be displayed alongside Clementine's harness, the special harness he designed for her, and she gave a speech at the memorial that made everyone cry. My brother lost his eyes in the war, and this horse became his eyes. But more than that, she became his reason to live, his proof that he wasn't useless, his daily reminder that he mattered. And when he died, she lost her reason too, lost her purpose, and we almost lost her. But something beautiful happened. She found a new purpose, helping others understand what true loyalty looks like, teaching all of us that purpose doesn't have to end when circumstances change. It can transform, can become something different but equally valuable, and that's what she did. She transformed her grief into service, her loss into lessons, her pain into purpose, and that's the legacy she leaves. Not that she was a guide horse, but that she was loyal beyond understanding, devoted beyond reason, and purposeful until her very last breath. This story teaches us that purpose is both a blessing and a curse. It gives us reason to wake up, reason to try, reason to keep going. But when that purpose disappears, when the job ends, or the person leaves, or the circumstances change, we're left with a void that can destroy us if we let it. Clementine could have died of grief in those first months, could have given up completely, and no one would have blamed her. But instead, through the compassion of strangers and the power of community, she found a new purpose, different but meaningful, and that's the lesson. That purpose isn't fixed, isn't permanent. It's something we can rebuild and redefine and rediscover, even when we think we've lost it forever. And Samuel's story reminds us that independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about finding the right support, the right partnerships, the right connections that let us be ourselves. Even when circumstances try to take that away, Samuel could have spent his life in a veteran's home, feeling useless and forgotten. But instead, he took a crazy chance on teaching a horse to be his eyes. And it worked because he was willing to trust, willing to try, willing to build something new from the wreckage of what he'd lost. And that courage, that refusal to accept defeat, that determination to live life on his own terms, that's what made his story remarkable. Not the blindness, but the response to the blindness. Not the loss, but the rebuilding. Where are you watching from? Have you ever lost something that defined you so completely that you didn't know who you were without it? Have you ever had to find a new purpose after the old one disappeared? Share your story in the comments below.